All right, John, just tell me a little bit about your experience in Pearl Harbor and your military background.
Telling me about my background?
Yeah, what you just told me about when you were in Pearl Harbor.
Oh, when I was in Pearl Harbor, that was our home port of Pearl Harbor. We operated out of Pearl Harbor. I was on the destroyer USS Ward. It was an old World War I type destroyer. It was the last destroyer the U.S. put in commission before the war started. And aboard the Ward, I was a fireman, and my duty was working in the fire room aboard the ship.
Tell me about the day of Pearl Harbor.
Well, on December 7th, 41, I was in the hospital at Pearl Harbor. There was nothing wrong with me. The doctor asked me if I wanted to hang around the hospital a while or if I want to go back to my ship. I said, I'll go back to my ship, but in the meantime, the crew of the Ward, they were designated to march down on one of the Hawaiian Islands, and I told him that I don't need to go down there and march. He says, well, you can stay here and hang out here, which I did. And on the morning of December 7th, I got up and did my duties, which assignment what I had there. And then I was talking to another sailor who was on the second floor of the hospital, and all of a sudden a plane came in at rooftop level, and it had red meatballs on the side of it, and we said, holy smokes, that's the Japanese, we better get out of here. So I and the other fellow, we went down on the street, and the plane, and we looked at the plane, and it come back in again, and then we ducked behind a pillar, so if he shot at us, that we wouldn't get killed right away. I'd have missed the whole war. So anyways,
what about that Japanese?
Well, the Japanese plane, he came in on rooftop level, and he showed himself out of the side of the plane as he came in, and he was wearing a white bandana around his neck and so forth. And then he went out towards the entrance of Pearl Harbor, and then he come back that way, and by that time we had enough sense that we ducked behind a pillar while he came in, and then he shot at me, and I looked at him and he looked at me, and that was the beginning of the war. But anyways,
what happened to you after that day?
Well, I went back on my ship on Monday, and I had a real good view of all the ships that were shot at, and a lot of them were sunk right there in Pearl Harbor. And they asked if anybody was an engineer to run a whaleboat, and I said, I can run a whaleboat. So a bunch of officers come down. This is the next morning. A bunch of officers come down in their whites. So I thought, well, maybe they're in their whites because they've been up all night, who knows? But anyways, they asked me if I could run a whaleboat, and I said, sure, I can run one. So we went around and inspected every ship that was down in Pearl Harbor, and they were still trying to get the guys off one of the battleships. I forget the name of the battleship right now. So we went around and inspected every ship that was down in Pearl Harbor, which is, and the officers, I don't know, maybe one of them was Admiral Nimitz for all I know, But anyways, we went out and looked at every ship in the harbor, and they were still trying to get the guys off the Oklahoma. Were trapped underneath, you know, in the compartment, and they trying to get a hole in the top of the ship. The ship was turned over, and so I don't know if they. I don't think that I know now that they didn't get all the fellas off the ship because they went down with their ship. Mm-hmm. And I had a buddy on the Arizona because the week before I asked one of the guys off my ship if he wants to go over and visit my buddy who's on the Arizona. And the kid on the Arizona lived across the street from me, and he joined the Navy a little ahead of myself. So we went over and visited him, and he survived the sinking of the Arizona, and then there was nothing, like I said, I was in the hospital, nothing wrong with me. I was just monkeying around.
That's me on the right.
Okay, Gene, I'd just like you to tell us a little bit about your military experience and with Pearl Harbor.
And what?
And Pearl Harbor.
And Pearl Harbor.
Mm-hmm.
I spent this first from March 41 to November 41 on the USS Ward patrolling the Hawaiian Islands. Nighttime, wartime conditions. There were no lights at night. We were looking for Japanese submarines. Anyway, so November 1st, I was transferred into the pay office, which paid the 4 destroyers. So on December 7th, myself and another man were sleeping in the pay office. We had our army cots. When we heard the bombs dropping, and we were right about a half a block from the stream that the torpedo planes were flying by. So we ran out, and we could see they were almost even with us. They were so low, dropping their torpedoes into the battleships. So we threw our clothes on, of course, and ran down there, and we were right across from all the battleships. And so we saw everything. I saw the bomb drop on the Arizona, and they tell us in 1 second 1,100 men were killed. It was just, you didn't know what was going on. It just, it just seemed like eternity before we really started shooting back. It was scary. We had to run and hide behind things to keep from getting machine gun. The planes were diving to and strafing us, so we hid behind anything we could find to hide behind. And it was just in a state of shock, I guess. It was sort of horrible. I saw the men, I saw the Oklahomas tipping over and the fellows sliding off Oklahoma's battleship, sliding off into the water that was covered with burning oil. And some of the fellows jumped in boats to try to rescue these men struggling in the burning water. And the Japanese, of course, started strafing them and us. So when it was over, we went back to our office, and we had to move out of there about 3 days later. And we found bullets in our books where we'd been sitting. Later on that afternoon, we found the bullet holes in the bolts in our books. So we moved out there about 3 days later and went over by the submarine base. And we worked 36 hours straight in our pay office trying to set up some kind of pay records for the men in the battleships. But it was all like a nightmare.
Then you went to Iwo Jima after that?
Well, I went to, actually, in May 43, I took a test, was sent back to the States to go to officer school. And that didn't set with me, so then I went back to the regular Navy, and I ended up getting attached to a group of military police. They were sheriffs and deputy sheriffs from different southern states, and we didn't know where we were going, but we ended up in Iwo Jima. We went in there 2 weeks after the invasion, And they put us in, we had to dig foxholes. We lived there for about a month. And of course, that was kind of exasperating because the reason I joined the Navy, I hoped to avoid all this. But anyway, we lived in our foxholes for about a month. Then went from tents and finally ended up in Quonset huts when the thing settled down. All in all, I was in Iwo Jima for 6 months. And again, I was very, very fortunate. Because there were thousands and thousands of men were killed on that island. It was a godforsaken place. There was nothing there. We had blown it all to pieces. But we wanted the island to put our fighter planes on there, so when the big B-29s flew over to bomb Japan, it was such a long distance that they wanted the Iwo Jima to keep fighter planes on it, which was about halfway between where the planes started and bombed Japan. So our fighter planes flew up and met the B-29s and escorted them to bomb Japan, and then they flew back. And some of the planes were shot up, and they just, the B-29s, so they just parachuted out and the planes dove in the water. So it's kind of a nightmare. And after I got out of service, we had on the ward, we did have a bad storm where the ship almost rolled over at 148 degrees. And I dreamt for about 5 years that the ship was turning over and I was in the water. And my wife would have to yell and wake me up get me out of what do you call it, a nightmare or whatever. Every time a fire engine would go by the house, of course, I'd just literally leap out of bed, run outside, sit in the steps, smoking a cigarette. But I can realize these fellows over in Iraq and Afghanistan, how they would just, it's so frightening. It's something you have to experience yourself. It seemed glamorous at first to hear about fighting the Japs, but after the fellows got a little taste of it, it's different. It's a different ball game. And unfortunately, some of the fellows can't stand it and they commit suicide. So it's something that I'm glad I went through, but I certainly wouldn't want to go through it again.